Well, good afternoon, and we'll call this conference committee meeting together for transportation, and welcome everyone here. And we will, maybe we should first start with some introductions so everybody can know who's here. And why don't we start? Jenny?
I'm Jenny Nash with the House DFL Research Department.
I'm Natalie Cicchini, the CLA for the House Transportation Committee.
Jeff Howe, represent District 13A.
Tim Sanders, 37B, which is Blaine.
John Petersburg, Old Town of Waseca.
Andy Lee, House Fiscal.
Matt Burris, House Research.
Joe Marble, Committee Administrator for the House Transportation Committee.
Tim Kelly, representative from Red Wing.
Scott Dibble, State Senator from Southwest, Downtown, and South Minneapolis.
Bonnie Berezovsky, Senate Counsel.
Krista Boyd, Senate Fiscal Analyst.
Suzanne Sabatka, Committee Administrator for the Senate Transportation and Public Safety Committee.
I'm Vicki Jensen, represent Senate District 24, which is Steele, Rice, Dodge, and Waseca counties.
Fong He, State Senator, representing East Side of St. Paul, District 67.
And Mr. Chair, we'll have Mr. Olson and Senators Kent and Schmidt introduce themselves when they get here.
Fantastic. Great. Well, this being our first meeting, just welcome to everyone again for being here. And I assume if you are here, most likely you are very much in touch with the transportation bills that have passed through the Senate and the House. One of the things that we are going to be doing today is a walkthrough of the bills. One thing that we've talked about that in respect of everyone's time and the process here, what we've directed the staff to do instead is to do more of a walkthrough on a, I would say, a conceptual basis, not to, we don't need to read line by line and word by word, because I think we're all, like I say, very much in touch with what's here. So we're going to do that today, and then as we walk through that, we will certainly have clarifying questions and things from members. We're certainly open to that, but today we want to get through this and put us all on the same page. And with that, I will hand this off to Mr. Burris and Mr. Lee.
Mr. Chair and members, I'll walk through kind of the conceptual differences or the positions on the House side for revenues and appropriations. Starting off with kind of the structure of how the House bill works is the House File 4 appropriates all of the funds that are dedicated to transportation, all the new funds dedicated. Oh, hang on just a second. If Mr. Marble could distribute the summary there, that'd be helpful. So House File 4 appropriates all the new funds available as a result of the House tax bill. And what the House tax bill does is it dedicates a number of general fund items, sales tax and other tax pieces to transportation. So it's one of the larger pieces is dedicating the general sales tax attributed to auto parts to the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund. And over the 16-17 biennium, that is estimated to bring in an additional 381 million to the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund, and as a result will cost the general fund that amount in the 16-17 biennium. But it's a bit higher in the 18-19 biennium at just under 500 million over the biennium. And so once that goes into the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund, it is further distributed to the Trunk Highway Fund, county state aid, and municipal state aid, and township and turnbacks. The next item is a dedication of the short-term rental on vehicles, and there's two taxes applied to this. The 2.5% general sales tax, an additional 9.2% tax over and above the general tax and whatever local taxes are applied for short-term rentals. The 2.5% is distributed starting in the 18-19 biennium to metropolitan area transit capital projects, and that generates about $39.4 million over that biennium, and subsequently has the cost of the general fund of that amount. Then the next item is the 9.2% tax applied to short-term rental vehicles, again, starting in the 18-19 biennium, that is estimated to generate about $55.8 million, and that is dedicated to small cities.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair.
Senator Jensen.
When you were talking about the dedication for metropolitan area, you said 2.5 is it percent, or is it 6.5?
I'm sorry, I
Okay.
meant 6.5%,
Okay, thank
the
you.
general sales tax. And then, Mr. Chair and members, one thing I will note on the auto parts and the rental vehicle taxes is this does not include the legacy amount. This is only the general fund portion of those taxes. The final two items on the revenue side are dedication of the general fund portion of the motor vehicle lease sales tax receipts. So currently, the general fund receives a flat $32 million a year from that tax, and everything in excess of that gets distributed 50-50 between Greater Minnesota Transit and 5 of the 7 metropolitan county state aid highway funds. And what the tax provisions that support House File 4 would do is it would split that $32 million between the 5 counties and Greater Minnesota Transit. One complicating factor is that in both the, or in the House tax bill, and I believe it's on the Senate side in the transportation bill, there's a correction of motor vehicle lease sales tax allocation. Currently, the transportation funds, Greater Minnesota Transit and the 5 county CASA, are receiving the amount associated with the legacy tax. And so, in effect, the general fund is being shorted that amount. So both the House tax bill and the Senate transportation bill corrects that, which is about $4.2 million additional a year to the general fund, and that much less split between the two transportation funds. Then I'll turn it over to Ms. Boyd for the Senate revenue items.
We could pause just a moment, Ms. White. Just want to make sure we get all introductions, and Representative Earhart, just to introduce yourself to the committee.
Representative Ron Earhart.
Okay.
Senator Susan Kent.
All right, Senator Matt Schmidt from Red Wing.
Great. Oh, yes. Come on.
Kyle Olson, Senator Dibble's LA.
Thank you very much. Please continue.
Mr. Chair and members, looking at the Senate revenues, there are a few more of them than the House side, so I'll try to go through those as quickly as possible. First, we have the new gross receipts motor fuels tax, 6.5% on wholesale sales, and that is all deposited in the highway user tax fund, similar to existing gas tax. And you'll see the revenue numbers there estimated at $776 million for the first biennium. The next big revenue item is changes to the vehicle registration tax. This increases.
Mr. Chair, are we asking questions as we go here?
Yes, Representative Earhart.
I'd like to ask the question of what price of gas are you calculating for number 6?
Mr. Chair, Representative Earhart, there's a floor set in the language at $2.50. So anything below $2.50 will still be set at $2.50, and that equates to equivalent 16.3 cents per gallon.
And that's what you're using for this, Mr. Chair?
Ms. White.
Mr. Chair, Representative Earhart, yes.
Thank you.
Yes. On the vehicle registration tax, Mr. Chair, the base rate increased from 1.25% to 1.5%. The depreciation schedule under vehicle registration does not change, nor does the minimum tax change under this proposal. All these new revenues, of course, will flow into the highway user tax fund, as all vehicle registration tax revenues do. And in the first biennium, that's estimated to be about $192 million. Next is the metro area transit sales tax. This is a 0.75% sales tax imposed on the metro area, and that all goes to Met Council. Well, the initial revenues go to Met Council, and that's estimated to be $636.5 million in the first biennium. Next is the motor vehicle sales tax reallocation in the Senate proposal. This is a small, or a 2% reduction. I should back up. Currently, the motor vehicle sales tax is split 60% to the highway user tax fund, 36% to metro area transit, and 4% to Greater Minnesota Transit. This is a shift of that allocation, so 2% reduction to highway user tax and 2% reduction to metro transit. And then that 4% will be shifted to Greater Minnesota Transit. So it's a shift of $61.2 million in the first biennium to Greater Minnesota Transit.
Ms. Boyd, one question, please. The line item 8, the 3/4 increase there, is that so that's in addition to the quarter cent, is that correct?
Mr. Chair, yes.
Thank you very much. And that also includes all the 7 counties now? Is that what the calculation is?
Remember where we ended up? It's all 7, yeah? Yes, okay. Mr. Chair, I just had to remember, there's been a couple iterations. It is all 7 counties, but there is an opt-out provision as well.
Thank you.
And Mr. Chair, continuing on, number 10, changes to the motor vehicle leasing sales tax. Currently, from the total revenues to motor vehicle leasing, $32 million remain in the general fund, and the rest is split 50-50 between the collar counties, the 5 metro counties excluding Hennepin and Ramsey, and then 50% to Greater Minnesota Transit. What this change would do is reduce the general fund allocation to $22 million a year, so $10 million a year will be shifted to transportation purposes, and Greater Minnesota's allocation will be eliminated. So the effect is that the metro counties will pick up the amount from Greater Minnesota Transit and the extra $20 million in the biennium. Also, Hennepin and Ramsey are added into the mix, but they are, for calculation purposes, at a reduced population. Hennepin at 25% population and Ramsey at 50%. So that's an additional $59 million to these counties in 16 and 17. Next is, Mr. Lee already touched on this, the allocation correction. That's the same in both bills, changing the allocation for motor vehicle lease sales tax. So that's a small gain to the general fund and a reduction to Greater Minnesota Transit and the CASA. Next, on number 12, are a couple of new surcharges on some driver and vehicle services fees. There's a new $10 surcharge on a filing fee when you renew your vehicle registration, and another $10 surcharge on the motor vehicle title transfer fee. This together brings in $114 million estimated in fiscal year 16 and 17. Those revenues will then be split between 2 new accounts created for city streets and bridges, 50-50. So 50% of that would go to non-municipal state aid cities, or small cities as the account is called, and then the larger cities account is for municipal state aid cities, eligible cities. But that's for use on local city streets and bridges, non-state aid roads. Next, number 13 is an increase in fees for license plates. For a set of regular plates, it's from $6 to now $12.50, and for special plates, the fee would go from $10 to $12.50. Estimated revenue for this change is $12.9 million in the first biennium, and that will be deposited, as all fees are, in the vehicle services operating account in the special revenue fund. Next, on number 14, this was a governor's change item. This was assessments on the railroads to be deposited in the rail grade crossing safety account for rail safety initiatives. And this is $65 million estimated in fiscal year 16 and 17.
I just wanted to expand on item number 13 quickly. The purpose for that is to stop the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund from subsidizing the production of license plates at MinCor. What happens right now is the Department of Public Safety uses HUTDF funds for that contract, and then, of course, they receive the fees back when we buy our plates. They keep those fees in the special services accounts, and so we convert that to a self-supporting function. By the slight increase, we slow down the rate at which plates need to be replaced from 7 to 10 years, the net effect is that, what, about $8 million a year is retained in the highway user tax distribution fund.
Thank you.
And then,
Mr.
Mr.
Lee.
Chair and members, moving back to the House side, there are some one-time spending items that transfer out of the general fund in fiscal 15. It's a total of $228 million. The first $50 million of that goes to small cities assistance to be spent via formula, and that's set at $25 million a year for the 16-17 biennium. And then just to draw your attention back up to the top of the page on line, or item 3, the 9.2 tax on short-term rental vehicles, essentially that takes over for that one-time cash starting in the 18-19 biennium. Then $114.5 million goes to county state aid highway, $35.5 million goes to municipal state aid streets, and those appropriations out of those constitutionally dedicated funds happen in fiscal 16. So in fact, the transfer happens in fiscal 15, and then the spending occurs in fiscal 16. And then finally, I'll note the $28 million split between Greater Minnesota Transit and the 5 collar counties.
Senator Jensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just wondering what the formula is on number 1 for 2016 and 17. Is there someplace I can find that, or because am I understanding this correctly? In 2016-17, there's a formula that would distribute the $50 million, and then going forward from there, it's $25 million. I'm just curious what the formula would be.
Yes, Mr. Chair and Senator Jensen, the formula stays the same for all years. So
Okay.
it starts at $25 million a year, and then it goes up a little bit in the 18-19 biennium when the tax switches to the rental as the source to pay for it. But there is a formula on the House side, and that is on R54 of the side-by-side document. Has the House language for the formula.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, how much is that total, this one-time spending? 228?
228 million, Representative Earhart.
Thank you.
Senator Dibble.
I'm sorry, I just missed as Mr. Lee was going through the 9.2% tax on short-term rentals takes over for funding item number 1, the small cities assistance. Was that right?
Correct.
Okay, great. Thanks. I just missed that. Thanks.
Okay, then, Mr. Chair and members, then moving on to summary level of appropriations for state roads. This doesn't include some of the smaller change items, but kind of the larger items for state road spending. On the House side, the House spends $51.2 million in increase for operations and maintenance over 16-17, and that is at the governor's recommended level. But it also sets aside $65 million a year specifically for snow and ice removal. So what this would have the effect of doing is setting a new base just for snow and ice removal, and then a separate item for operations and maintenance, kind of everything but that. Then the House bill reduces by $8.7 million over the biennium the appropriation for program delivery. This is essentially set at for fiscal 16, program delivery is 15% of the total state road appropriation, less debt service, and then it is subtracted down to 14% of the total state road appropriation, less debt service. So again, this is basically moving trunk highway funds from program delivery onto state road construction. But there's also a splitting out of the base, like with operations and maintenance, setting aside planning as a standalone base item. Then the House spends $415 million in increase in state road construction spending, not including debt service or federal spending. And the House also sets base items for non-state road MnDOT items and DPS administration that are currently funded from the Trunk Highway Fund in the 18-19 biennium, switching that to general fund. So in effect, what it does is, for example, there's a $1.1 million a year appropriation from the Trunk Highway Fund to Greater Minnesota Transit. And that would continue under the House bill in the 16-17 biennium, but starting in 18-19, that amount would be shifted to general fund, and the savings from the Trunk Highway Fund would in fact be rerouted back to state roads. And then the House also sets a forecasted base for trunk highway spending, that 90% of the unreserved fund balance in the Trunk Highway Fund would be forecasted to be spent. And in addition to that, the House has debt service to support $1.3 billion worth of trunk highway bonds authorized but issued over 7 years.
And Mr. Chair and members, I'll pick up on the 5 points or 6 points of the Senate State Road overview. Most of these are tied to the new revenues realized in the bill from the gross receipts tax and the increase in vehicle registration tax. First is an increase to the operations and maintenance appropriation of $46.4 million in the first biennium. Planning and program delivery increase of $89.6 million in 16 and 17. And a state road construction increase of $492 million in 16 and 17. And some other pieces of note are that there's a direct appropriation within state road construction aside from that $492 million of $105 million just for the biennium. And that is marked for turnbacks. And this is to replace, the Senate bill eliminates the flexible highway account, which right now receives part of the 5% set aside from the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund. And traditionally, that's up to the commissioner, the discretion of the Commissioner of Transportation to use within certain uses. And traditionally, that's been used for turnbacks, county and municipal and trunk highway turnbacks. So this $105 million is for the biennium to replace the elimination of the flexible highway account. And there's a provision in the bill to direct the commissioner in future biennial budget submissions to make recommendations for how much turnback amount will be needed.
Is that, Mr. Chairman, is
Senator
that
Hart.
5%, is that not constitutional? That's by statute?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Earhart, the 5% is listed in the Constitution for several purposes, and then the actual use of the 5% is set in statute by the legislature and can be changed every 6 years. Number 5 is a one-time appropriation of $5 million from Trunk Highway in 16 for noise barrier construction along trunk highways. And then number 6, similar to the House, is debt service appropriation for the biennium. The Senate bill authorizes $1 billion in trunk highway bonds of $250 million a year for 4 years. The first biennial debt service projection required for this is $21.4 million.
Thank you. Mr. Lee.
And then, Mr. Chair, on the House side for local roads, the House spends the county state aid highway that is a result of new revenues from the dedication of the auto parts general sales tax, which generates $137.7 million additional funds for CASA over the biennium, and $31.2 million additional funds for the municipal state aid streets over the biennium. And both of these exclude the one-time spending from the $228 million.
Mr. Chair, local roads on the Senate side, the first two again are tied to new revenues in the bill for Highway User Tax Fund, and these flow through by constitutional formula to county state aid and municipal state aid funds. So these are projected to be $261.4 million in 16 and 17 for county state aids, and municipal state aids of $101.8 million in the first biennium. And I'd like to note that that includes not just the 9% on the constitutional formula, but a portion of the 5% set aside that is changed in this bill. So municipal state aid will get a piece of that flexible highway account that was eliminated, a portion for them. Number 3 is a one-time appropriation of $10.7 million in trunk highway cash for local, or I'm sorry, not from general fund cash, for local bridge replacement. Number 4 is another appropriation from the general fund. This is an ongoing $2.5 million a year for safe routes to school infrastructure, and this was a governor's recommendation. Number 5 is a $6 million one-time appropriation from a new special revenue fund created in the bill, and this is for active transportation options for Greater Minnesota. This is bicycle, pedestrian, safe routes to school projects. This is tied to, part of the general fund target was used to transfer into the new active transportation account for Greater Minnesota, and then that's appropriated out to the commissioner for these purposes. And then lastly, there's a $5 million one-time appropriation from the general fund to MnDOT to be used to assist in design, maintenance, construction of highways on tribal lands.
Ms. Boyd, on line item 3, the local bridge replacement, is there a distribution formula? How would that be dispersed?
Mr. Chair, that goes into the local bridge replacement program that already exists. It's usually funded through the bonding bill. So that is through the state aid office, I believe, and that's how they do the priorities in the office there.
Thank you. Senator Dibble?
I guess Ms. Boyd said what I was just going to say, which is the bridge office at MnDOT has a kind of a ranking of priority bridges, and they kind of work through their list.
And Mr. Chair and members, moving on to the House position on transit. The first item is $14 million as part of the $228 million in one-time spending for Greater Minnesota Transit that's transferred out of the general fund in fiscal 15 but spent in fiscal 16. And then in subsequent years, as a result of the motor vehicle lease sales tax, general fund reallocation, but also subtraction from the correction, Greater Minnesota Transit would receive an additional $13.9 million a year starting in fiscal 17 and onward. But that is in addition to any growth in the lease sales tax. Then the House reduces the general fund appropriation to the Metropolitan Council by $110 million over the 16-17 biennium, and with language that's in the House tax bill, eliminates the general fund appropriation in fiscal 2018 and 19. And one point on that is that if only the House language in the transportation bill were to be enacted, the Metropolitan Council base would be set at, I believe, $9 million a year in general fund, and that's because of language that's in the tax bill that basically sets the Metropolitan Council budget at the general fund from 2015 less a few other changes. And in kind of how those changes were arrived at, the House bill requires that CTIB pay 100% of the Transitway operating subsidy. Currently, they pay 50%, so that generates about $30 million a year that, rather than being spent by CTIB, goes to the Metropolitan Council to pay for the operating subsidy of Transitways. And then the tax bill also moves $23.7 million also from CTIB to the Metropolitan Council for Transitway operations for fiscal, I should make one correction here, not for fiscal 2015, but for fiscal 2016. One other item that the House changes that isn't specifically a dollar amount, but has an effect on appropriations, is the House moves rather than a statutory appropriation for the Metropolitan Council and Greater Minnesota Transit to a direct appropriation. So in effect, what that does is currently the Metropolitan Council and Greater Minnesota Transit receive motor vehicle sales tax dollars via statutory appropriation. So the legislature doesn't every 2 years appropriate to them, and rather this would set it so that the House position would set it so that the legislature appropriates those dollars every 2 years.
Mr. Chair, on the Senate side for transit, one thing I didn't note here because it was already touched on in revenues, but should set the stage for Metro Transit changes is, of course, the $636 million projected in the first biennium for the metro area sales tax, and that will fund operations at Metro Transit. Accordingly, there is a Metro Transit General Fund reduction in the bill of $39.4 million in 16-17, and a smaller reduction in the tails of 10.8. This leaves enough in the general fund appropriation to fund Metro Mobility. The costs of Metro Mobility are increasing, so that reduction there's a decrease of the reduction in fiscal year 18-19 to account for those cost increases. The next two pieces have to do with Greater Minnesota Transit. As mentioned earlier in the revenue section, there's a shift of the dedicated funds that fund Greater Minnesota Transit. The leasing sales tax allocation is eliminated, and that is all shifted over to the metro counties. And that is replaced with a larger, basically a double allocation of motor vehicle sales tax. And in addition, the Greater Minnesota Transit operations receive an additional general fund appropriation, an increase of $12 million in 16-17, and then $3.5 million a year thereafter to the base.
Mr. Chairman, is there any place in here that we're looking at the transit where we're moving the quarter cent raised in the 7 counties outside of the taxing district? Did I understand that was somewhere in somebody's bill?
Go ahead.
Not in here, right? The little piece, no.
So I'm sorry, Representative Earhart, Mr. Chair. Are you asking if the transit taxing district itself is being expanded, the property tax, or the quarter cent?
Mr. Chairman, what I mean is the money that we're raising on the percent on the 7 counties, or the 5 counties, I guess, is that being moved out of where they're raised?
So, Mr. Chair, Representative Earhart, so the existing quarter cent is going to remain the same. That's enacted by the 5 counties in the Counties Transit Improvement Board themselves, and so that there's no change to that, although Carver and Scott could opt in at any time if they so choose. But the additional 3 quarters would be enacted by the state for all 7 counties. There is a mechanism by which counties can opt out of having that done in their counties, even though it's not a county tax, it's a state tax. So the short answer to your question is yes.
Well, Mr. Chairman, why did I hear that tax is being spent other than where it's raised? And that's not the case then.
I'm sorry. You wanted to add, Ms. Berzon?
Mr. Chair and Representative Earhart, the language provides that the sales tax that's raised in the metro area has to be spent in the counties in which it's raised.
That's a very good idea. Thank you.
Where are we at here?
I believe, Mr. Chair, Mr. Lee is next.
Pardon me? Ms. Boyd?
Oh,
I think she
Mr.
finished.
Chair, I believe I finished with the transit piece, so maybe Mr. Lee.
I think you did. Thank you.
Mr. Lee. Chair and members, moving on to DPS appropriations. A number of these are largely the same between the House and the Senate. The House has the 1.8% operating adjustments for DPS and 3% increase for the State Patrol. The House, so one difference though is the House fully funds the governor's recommendation for a new fixed-wing aircraft for the State Patrol at $975,000. The House has a very similar item on capital security with both base adjustment and a revenue or a change item that increases the amount. There's a very minor technical difference between the House and the Senate position on that, but largely the appropriation levels are the same. And then the House also has additional operating adjustment for vehicle services identical to the Senate. And there's one other item that I'll touch on a little bit later in DPS having to do with State Patrol too. Turn it over to Ms. Boyd.
Ms. Boyd.
Mr. Chair, this should go quick because the House and the Senate are very similar on much of DPS's items here. One of the changes, the governor's recs for operating adjustments are the same. The change on number 6 is that the Senate opted to put $500,000 instead of $975,000 from the Trunk Highway Fund toward a purchase of 1 aircraft for the State Patrol. Capital security increase is the same. Number 8 is a Senate-only provision, and this we touched on earlier. It's an elimination of the appropriation of vehicle services from the highway user tax fund and replaces it with a like appropriation from the vehicle services operating account. This is supported by what we discussed, the increase in the license plate fees. And on the next page, the additional operating adjustment is the same in both the House and Senate.
Then, Mr. Chair and members, there's a few non-DVS spending on the House side that spends down the fund balance of the vehicle services account. I have them listed on the last page. Port Development Assistance, rail grade crossing safety, replacing a radio tower near Roosevelt, Minnesota, on Lake the Isles, $3 million over 2 years for a suburban transit pilot project, $400,000 over 2 years for travel demand management organizations in the Twin Cities, and the largest item, or second largest item, $3.5 million in one-time costs for a state trooper academy, and then $900,000 for Duluth and St. Cloud emergency response.
And Mr. Chair, 2 items, although I may add one orally to Senate under the other category, is an appropriation from the Highway User Tax Fund to the Department of Revenue. This will be an ongoing appropriation. The Highway User Tax Fund already funds directly the Department of Revenue and their Petroleum Division to assist in administration of the gas tax, and this would be an additional appropriation to for increased costs of administration of the new gross receipts tax. So that's $456,000 for the biennium. Next is just a note of these are statutory tax interactions related to gross receipts tax and vehicle registration tax changes. For instance, vehicle registration tax, if people's vehicle registration tax increases, they can claim a greater change on their income tax. So these are amounts that will be paid out from the general fund, and those total $7.7 million in fiscal year 16 and 17. I just wanted to note one other that I didn't list on here, and it's small, is that the bill creates a road user charge working group, and there are some administrative expenses for that split between MnDOT and the Legislative Coordinating Commission, and that is $276,000 for the biennium, one time from the general fund.
Thank you very much. Mr. Burris?
Mr. Chair and members, I'll move into some of the policy and finance provisions outside of the appropriations. And first, there are a couple of provisions that are technical or have some technical differences or identical. A couple of these come from the governor's original budget submission to the legislature. And then there are a few policy differences. A couple of these have been touched on already. One of the bigger areas of discussion for the committee at a later point is the trunk highway bonding. There's a difference in amount. There's also a couple of differences around the number of years in which the authorization occurs. And if you wanted to follow along on the side-by-side language, R36 is really the substantive beginning of the trunk highway bonding articles. So the House has a 7-year authorization period, whereas the Senate has a 4-year authorization period. There are some differences between the House and Senate as to what the trunk highway bond proceeds are put towards. Both the House and the Senate primarily fund or largely fund Corridors of Commerce program. The House language includes some additional criteria around project selection. The House and Senate also both provide funding for the Transportation Economic Development Program. That's at the bottom of page R37. The Senate amount is a lot higher, whereas the House position includes more funding, or actually a substantial section of the House's funding is for state road construction generally. So that would be bond funds that just go towards the MnDOT state road construction program. And then there are some other technical differences between the House and Senate, but I think that's the essence of the differences on that. Another provision that's been touched on previously is highway rail grade crossing improvements. The House has a a one-time transfer, and the Senate language includes a ongoing assessment for grade crossing improvements, but that can be viewed as being in the policy difference category. Small cities aid had been touched on previously. And then there are a couple other provisions with some policy differences. One is on volunteer firefighter benefits and reporting. And this is on a couple different pages, but R117 is really in the side-by-side language, the starting point for that. On the House side, this is section 12, and a lot of the substantive language continues into page R118. And there's some differences on eligibility and coverage level requirements. Another area of difference between the House and Senate, but they're kind of similar, somewhat similar approaches, is in the modifications to the operating costs that the state, under state statute, is required to pay for light rail transit. And this can be found in a couple of different places in the side-by-side language. R126 contains the House language, and the substantive actual language of the House provision is on R127, in which 100% of ongoing light rail transit operating and maintenance costs would need to come from non-state sources. And the Senate language is found in a repealer, and that's at the end of the side-by-side on page R144. And on the Senate side, that is section 6, and it repeals the entire provision. And sorry for jumping around a little bit here, but the next policy difference item is on MnDOT agency efficiencies. This can be found back at page R127. Both the House and the Senate address efficiency requirements, and there's some differences as to reporting, specifying a specific goal percentage between the House and the Senate. Another policy difference area to highlight is the creation of a pilot program for public-private partnerships. This is on several pages. It starts at the bottom of page R132. The House language on this excludes some types of mechanisms that could be considered with the program. Tolling is excluded. The House language also includes a maximum of 25 years for transfer of authority, and has an expiration in 2019 for the public-private partnership authorization language. And some of the highlights on the Senate side is that there's a broader set of mechanisms that could be utilized under the program. The Senate language also includes creation of a joint program office for oversight of some of the aspects of the program, whereas the House language has some of the same actors involved, but it's a consultation type process. And the Senate language also includes a delayed effective date. There's also some technical differences between the House and Senate. The motor vehicle lease sales tax reallocation has been covered, so I won't go into detail, but I'll just highlight that again as the House and Senate having different approaches in how much and to where the revenue from motor vehicle lease sales tax is allocated. Again, that's on the House side, found in the tax bill. On the Senate side, that's on page R107. And then one other policy difference item to note is a texting while driving fine. And in the House language, on the side-by-side, this can be found on page R80. And this is one to highlight as also existing in a couple other bills that have passed the House and Senate. So Senate File 878 reflects the House position that's in Conference Committee for Public Safety, Judiciary, Finance. And that's identical language with this provision on the House side. And Senate File 406 has a similar provision with a policy difference as to the amount of funds and how the total amount gets calculated on the penalty. So those two Senate files are being conferred in another committee, just so that this committee is aware some of the moving parts around that provision. Another area to highlight are that there are a number of provisions that are house only in the side-by-side language, but also reflect the kind of the position of the Senate in general, having been passed out of the Senate in Senate File 1647. And this is a variety of policy type provisions ranging from motorcycle headlamps to electronic billboards, federal out-of-service orders, overdimensional load escort permit. So there are a number of things that look like it's just house only, depending on the extent to which this conference committee is going to look at Senate File 1647. A number of those provisions, as found in that bill, are identical to the House language here. And then there are some provisions from that bill where there's somewhat of a policy difference between House File 4 and Senate File 1647. Commercial vehicle inspection reporting, a requirement around funds for safe routes to schools are a couple of examples of that. And then, Mr. Chair and members, I'll move into some of the more true House-only provision highlights. One is on page R41, and this is the creation of the Transportation Stability Fund. And the walkthrough on the appropriations and transfers highlighted the effect of what happens. This is some of the language around a new fund that's created that has a couple of accounts that are effectively passed through, so that the dedication and the taxes bill of a couple of state general sales tax revenue streams would pass through this Transportation Stability Fund and then on to other accounts and funds. So Highway User Tax Distribution Fund is an example for that.
Well, Mr. Chairman, why wouldn't those go directly to the, where they're going to, whatever they're going to fund? Why do we have to store some of those funds?
Mr. Chair, Representative Earhart, that's an alternative approach that the conference committee could look at if ultimately if the desire is to deposit the funds directly. The language here establishes a new fund, and in a couple of cases, if the accounts that are being created in this new fund weren't created here, they would need to be created in some other fund. And in a couple of cases, it's effectively a pass-through that provides, could be seen as providing a tracking mechanism. One of the requirements in the creation of the new fund is that financial reporting needs to be provided at the account level so that any funds that would pass through a specific account would be identified in future forecast and MMB reporting.
More, Mr. Chairman, more kind of busy work, or more bureaucracy in between the spending and appropriation?
Mr. Chair, Representative Earhart, you could characterize it, I guess, in a couple of different ways. One way would be to express it as adding another fund that creates some intricacies. Another way is expressing it as establishing some identifiable purposes as expressed through some of the accounts that are being created.
Thank you.
Another item that's House-only language that had been touched on previously was creation of base appropriations for the Trunk Highway Fund, out of the Trunk Highway Fund for a couple of the budget activities that are part of MnDOT's budget. This can be found on page R46, and on the House side, it's actually starts at the bottom of page R45, section 12, but the main language is on R46. What this provision does is direct MnDOT to utilize what would otherwise be the undesignated fund balance. And those funds would be built into the forecasting of appropriated dollars, base appropriations for future budgets. And it would be split within the state roads program, it would be split between operations and maintenance and state road construction. So this language would essentially have the effect of lowering the undesignated fund balance down significantly and baking those dollars into what the base or starting point appropriations levels would be for MnDOT State Roads program.
Well, Mr. Chairman, on an ongoing basis, are they, thank you, Mr. Chairman, are they going to be the same, once that spend down takes place, is that the part that you're spending down replenished on a regular basis? Or is, once you spend it down, is it not?
Mr. Chair, Representative Earhart, I wouldn't classify it as a spend down because it's not yet spending authority that's been provided to the department. By being built into the base appropriations, that's really the starting point of the initial dollar amount from which the legislature determines what appropriation to select. So, the basic calculus is typically, base appropriation, there's some change items, and then there's the amount appropriated in a budget bill. So I would express it more as how the base gets set, so apart from that, kind of more into the essence, I think, of your question, the dollar amount that this would reflect is what the expected revenues are. So if federal, if there's a transportation reauthorization at the federal level and the expected dollars go up, that would translate into a higher base appropriations for MnDOT State Roads program.
Thank you.
Okay. And then, Mr. Chair and members, another highlight is on R46. I'm sorry, R48. This is a house-only provision. It's section 15. This would create a prohibition on MnDOT utilizing its funds for highway projects on aesthetic enhancements. The enhancement increases the total cost of the project. And this would be funding from federal or state sources. This provision wouldn't apply to local uses of funds or local dollars put towards MnDOT projects. And then there are a couple other provisions that I won't go into too much detail on. There are two special provisions, a contingent appropriation for snow and ice that's modified but based on the governor's recommendation as part of the governor's budget submitted to the legislature. Page R84 has another one that's a house-only provision worth highlighting. And this language in sections 30, 31, and 32 modifies an existing special permit for overweight vehicles. And the existing permit is for 6 and 7 axle motor vehicles to haul raw or unprocessed agricultural products. That's the current law version of the current law provision. The main language can be found on page R85, 43.10 through 43.16. And this is an expansion of the types of products that could be hauled so that additional commodities and materials such as feed and seed and fertilizer and aggregate would be able to be hauled under the permit. And the language also includes a backhaul type provision so that a combination of these types of products could be hauled under a single permit. So, one product could be taken somewhere and then something else could be hauled back. Another highlight is a series of sections that are house only. On legislative authorization for development of transitways and guideways. There are a number of cross-reference clarifications on the House side, but the main language is found on page R99. And it's section 41. And this requirement is that the Met Council, as well as other political subdivisions such as regional railroad authorities, would not be able to complete an alternatives analysis or select a locally preferred alternative for various types of fixed guideway and transitway projects unless there's been some form of authorization from the legislature. And that would take the form of a law that's enacted that specifically authorizes the project, or if there were state funds appropriated for the project. And then, Mr. Chair and members, there are a couple other provisions involving studies, legislative reports, turnback, and I'm happy to go into the details on specifics around those, but that hits some of the highlights on the House-only language. And then I think Ms. Berezoski has some of the Senate-only provisions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members, I will highlight just a few of the Senate-only provisions, as a number of the Senate provisions have already been mentioned by Mr. Burris. I don't think this was mentioned before, that there is in the Senate side a penalty for late vehicle registration, and that would be in the amount of $25 a month for each month or partial month that the registration payment is late, up to a maximum of $100, and that money would go into the Highway User Fund. Then I would like to point.
Can you point the page number?
Yes, sorry, Mr. Chair. That is on R60 and R75. There are two different sections. One dedicates the money to highway user and one imposes the penalty. Okay. Then the next provision that I would like to call your attention to, and it has been mentioned a little bit, but I'll say a little bit more about it, and that is the metro area sales tax. And that is found, it begins on R108. And I believe that R112, I think, is the new language. So in the Senate bill, there are some changes made to the existing quarter cent that is now imposed in 5 counties and administered by CTIB. Those changes include the elimination of the Gears Committee, some tinkering with the purposes for the expenditures, and then some language that was added on the Senate floor is that CTIB has to have a goal of at least 40% of that quarter cent tax proceeds to be used in Dakota, Ramsey, or Washington counties, and that would be through the life of the council's 2030 plan. Then there is a new 3/4 cent tax that is imposed by the state on all 7 counties in the metro area. And that, as has been alluded to, if at least there is an opt-out mechanism, that mechanism is that if at least 4 of the 7 counties choose to opt out by June 15, 2015, then they are opted out. They will not have the 3/4 cent tax. And actually, in Carver and Scott, who do not currently impose the quarter cent, the tax imposed there is 1 cent, so that it would be, if all 7 counties stay within the new tax language and do not opt out, then there would be 1 cent metro-wide.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Earhart. Representative Earhart, if I could remind you just to pull the mic down, please, so everyone
sorry.
can hear.
You had something about 25% in each of some counties that are not participating in this? Said something about.
Mr. Chair, if I'm understanding the question, what I meant to say is that all 7 counties will have a 1 cent sales tax imposed. And so that's a 3/4 cent increase in the 5 counties that are now implementing the quarter cent. And it's a 1 cent increase in Carver and Scott counties.
Was there, Mr. Chairman, was there some minimal amount? My question is, are they going to receive more than they're raising? I guess that's what, I thought I heard you say something along those lines, but I could be wrong.
Mr. Chair and Representative Earhart, maybe, maybe what I said was having to do with the first quarter cent, that there's a 40% goal for Dakota, Ramsey, and Washington. And that is on the existing quarter cent.
Mr. Chairman, how do you mean there's a goal of 40% of what? Of the 25%? Even though they may not be participating now, or is this the existing?
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Chair.
Well, then my question is, are they going to be receiving more with that figure than they're raising?
Mr. Chair and Representative Earhart, that would be possible, and I believe that the justification was based on population in those areas rather than sales tax revenues.
Well, okay, that answers the question, I think. Thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Chair? Okay, yep. Okay, then going back to the new 3/4 cent tax, I mentioned the opt-out provision that requires, that would be implemented or triggered if 4 counties choose to opt out, or at least 4 counties choose to opt out. There's also one other provision that may affect the tax rate in Carver and Scott, because they are eligible to impose their own sales tax being outside of the initial quarter cent area. And if they impose their own sales tax up to a half cent is what the statutory authorization is, then that would reduce that 1 penny by that amount. So in other words, if Carver County were to impose a sales tax within its own county of a half cent, then its participation in the metro area sales tax program would be reduced to half cent. So the total would be 1 cent.
Well, Mr. Chairman, are they going to be participating fully in, I have to almost look at some numbers, I think. Are they going to be participating fully in whatever the other, if Scott should do what they're talking about, which is raising their own?
Mr. Chair and Representative Earhart, if that the legislation would allow Carver and/or Scott to impose its own tax to be used in its own county up to half cent, and that would reduce their participation then in the metro-wide tax.
Okay, even though they're not participating now, Mr. Chairman, that would be ongoing from, if this took place.
Mr. Chair, yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Chair and members, let's see, the new language specifies a number of uses. The majority of the money, the bulk of the money would go to the Met Council, the revenues from the new taxes. And Met Council then would be required to operate the bus and transitway system. They would be required to utilize 10% of the revenues for bicycle trail, pedestrian safe routes, and active transportation programs. The council would be required to use the money to expand the transit system service up to, or not up to, but a 4% average annual increase. The council would be required to maintain affordable transit fares, construct and improve transit shelters, give grants to the Center for Transportation Studies at the university. And then there are a couple of uses that mirror appropriation, I believe they're appropriations on the House side. $390,000 each year to transportation management organizations, $1.5 million each year to replacement service providers, the opt-outs for the Suburban Connections program.
Mr. Chairman, are the opt-outs going to continue their opt-outing, or are they going to be included in what this whole scheme here? Ms. Beers-Less.
Mr. Chair and Representative Earhart, they would still, the opt-outs would still receive their funding through the Met Council, but from the motor vehicle sales tax. And then this is just a specific Suburban Connections program that, that I think is in both bills.
Okay.
Okay. Then, Mr. Chair, the railroad assessments were mentioned, and I thought I would just touch on that briefly. The Commissioner of Transportation is authorized to assess up to $32.5 million annually on Class 1 railroad companies that operate in the state of Minnesota. It would be, the assessment would be divided up according to route miles within the state. And that money would be used, it would be placed in a special account. It would be used to create an Office of Rail Safety within MnDOT and also to improve highway rail grade crossings around the state. Then oh, and I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, that's on R100 if you want to see the language. The next Senate-only initiative that I'd like to mention is the driving privilege licenses. And that begins on R86 and goes through R92. And this is an initiative that would grant driver's licenses to people who are residents of Minnesota who are unable to prove authorized presence in the United States. So it would be a card that would be marked driving only. And it would not be usable for anything except driving. It would not be usable to prove identity or to vote or for any other purpose for which a driving license can be used. There is a fee assessed. I believe it's $17.25. It's the same as for any other driver's license. And so a person applying for this card would have to attest to a residence in the state of Minnesota, which is the same as what every applicant has to do, and then prove identity. And this language would broaden the notion of what is acceptable as proof of identity, so that there would be certain documents from foreign countries that would be acceptable proof of identity. And the next section that I will mention is on R137, and that is the city parking facility fee authorization. And this language authorizes the city of Minneapolis and the city of St. Paul independently to adopt an ordinance that would levy a fee on owners of commercial, non-residential parking spaces in the city, in the downtown areas. Basically, it's an area that's defined in the language, the downtown area of Minneapolis or the downtown area of St. Paul. And the amount is not specified. The city councils are given authority to levy different amounts on different types of parking facilities. And the proceeds would be used for a variety of improvements within the areas that are assessed. The assessment would be on the owner of the parking facilities. And then finally, I'll mention some, excuse me, of the studies and reports that are on the Senate side. There is a road user charge working group that's created on R140, and that would be handled or would be run by MnDOT. There would be legislative and executive and public members, and they would be charged with looking at the policy and the technical aspects of implementing a road user charge. And there are quite a few issues mentioned in the language, including how would the proceeds be used? Would they be constitutionally dedicated? Is this a feasible substitute or replacement for our fuels, motor fuels taxes to support our transportation system? privacy concerns, timelines, pilot projects, and so on. Then there is on R142, I guess I don't have these in order very well, there's a MnDOT effectiveness and innovation study. And this would be accomplished by the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, the Carlson School of Management, and a University of Wisconsin Transportation Study Institute that would take a look at MnDOT, the way it's structured, its divisions, its employee to management ratios, and a lot of other organizational kinds of issues that within MnDOT, budgeting and so on, and determine whether it's effective, whether it's innovative, and whether the existing structure contributes to the achievement of the goals of our transportation system. Then on, let's see, on R138, there is, the Senate directs MnDOT to come up with a plan that would make their project selection process more objective, easier for the public to understand and follow. Projects would be scored based upon criteria that would include things like local priorities and benefit costs, geographic balance, congestion mitigation, environmental concerns, and so on. And the scoring would actually be published on the web so that it could be tracked by anybody who is interested. So the Senate in its bill is asking or directing MnDOT to come up with the process and present it to the legislature and implement it in 2016. And finally, on R143, there is a direction to MMB to report on all expenditures and transfers out of dedicated transportation funds from, I believe it's 2010 to 2015, and the reason for the expenditures or transfers. And that concludes my highlighted sections.
Thank you, Ms. Brzezowski. And Ms. Boyd, Mr. Lee, Mr. Burris, I think certainly you've done wonderful work. I know it was a little diversion from our standard process of walking through, but as Senator Dibble and I talked, we thought this was a logical place for us to start, just from the standpoint of where the bill's set. So we certainly appreciate you doing that for us. Thank you very much. Any questions from members on what we just walked through as far as clarifying or points at this point? Well, then what we would like to do at this point in time, we do have some provisions that are identical with just some technical differences there, and we would like to walk through those at this point in time, and we'll walk through those provisions. And Mr. Burris, would you, if we started there with, that's okay with you, Senator? Sure. If you would start with those.
Mr. Chair and members, the first of the identical and technical difference provisions can be found on page R42. And this is section 6 on the House side, section 1 on the Senate side. If I might mention one thing that I was going to say earlier on, the Senate language is on the right-hand side of the side-by-side document. The House language is on the left, being a House file. And as a result, in order to line things up and with the program that's used in generating the side-by-side, this document has combined the Senate's language that consists of multiple articles into essentially one big article that's in statutory order. So it's the usual order, but it's reordered things from the standpoint of what the original Senate language is that had things kind of logically broken up into multiple articles. So what you'll see in working through the side-by-side on the Senate side are some things where it looks like section numbers repeat or seem out of order, and that's a result of the renumbering that starts when you look at it from the standpoint of article by article. So just so that members are aware of the context of why you might see some odd section numbering. So this provision is originally part of the governor's language on the governor's budget and would direct funds that result from MnDOT's sale of or licensing of software that MnDOT has developed in-house, so that the funds go into the trunk highway fund instead of going towards the Min IT services account. And that language has a small technical difference, but otherwise is identical between the House and Senate. And then, Mr. Chair, did you want me to run through the rest of the identical provisions, or pause on this one at this point?
Why don't we pause just a moment, Mr. Burris, and what is the technical difference there?
The technical difference is a comma that is on 29.17 on the House side, 61.18 on the Senate side. And if the committee would like to discuss the comma, I'm get into details on that.
Well, let me first take the temperature of my members. The idea we have up here is create momentum and goodwill. Get ready for all good things to just break out in the heavens, to start singing, and let the rest of the legislature know that we can get it done here in transportation. Do the members have this document? Maybe. All right.
No.
We do.
So, well, there, at least on the items that are pretty much identical, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of those, and they're all pretty non-controversial. So the proposal is that we move to adopt the similars or the identicals. Okay, great. We'll get a copy of this so you can kind of like glance ahead. What do you think?
Agreed.
All right, great. Although, Mr. Chair, I understand from, I don't know if we do need to I don't know about the comma, if it's important or not. But there's some feeling about the comma on our side.
Well, we can certainly discuss the comma, Mr. Boyd.
So the comma is after the word funds on 61.18 on the Senate side. So the comma is the Senate's comma. So, Mr. Chair, I will make a motion. I'll move the Senate language on, what is the proper motion? Senate language on 61.16 to 61.18 on R42. Is that the proper motion?
The whole section.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll move the whole section. Excuse me. So I'll move section 1 on page R42, Senate language.
Senator Dibble will move section 1 on R42 of the Senate language.
Yes, because there's 2 section ones here.
Oh, excuse me, there are 2 section 1s. So I'll move the first section 1, line 61.6 to 61.18.
Right, and clarification, Senator Dibble moves section 1, line 61.6 to 61.18. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. That motion is approved and adopted. Look at that, we are on a roll. Should we keep going?
Art's here.
We got to
All
come.
right.
We're ahead of every other conference committee.
Okay. Note the time, it is 2:31. Mr. Burris.
Mr. Chair and members, the next of these is on page R51 at the bottom. It's section 14 on the House side, section 5 on the Senate side. The language itself is actually on the next page on R52 at the top. This provision essentially provides MnDOT with a little bit broader authority to actively manage its properties as far as conveying the property, sales, leases, and establishes a statutory appropriation. I'm sorry, let me take that back. It provides for account funds that would go into an account around the active management could get canceled back to the trunk highway fund. So it's essentially a broadening of MnDOT's authority around active property management. This is another one of the governor's provisions from the governor's bill. And this one is identical. There are no comma differences that I've identified.
Mr. Chair, I'll move the House language.
Oh. Is that
So starting
section
on
14?
Section 14 on the bottom of R51 going through R52 to line 33.9.
Senator Dibble moves section 14, line items 32.30 through 33.9. House language. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. That motion is approved.
Can I have that reference again, please, Mr. Chairman?
It's on R51, starting on R51, the House language, 32.30, moving to 33.9.
And then, Mr. Chair and members, the next provision is on page R53. This is section 18 on the House language and section 6 on the Senate language. And this is a modification to the split of funds that goes to county state aid highways. Under current law, there are two formulas for allocating the county state aid highway dollars. And there's also a calculation for how much of the funds that come into the county state aid highway fund are allocated under each of those formulas. And the language in both the House and Senate here creates a set split so that of all the dollars that come into the fund that's available for allocation, there are a couple of deductions that occur beforehand, but all the direct aid that goes out to the counties would be 68% on kind of the quote-unquote old formula and 32% on the excess sum, the new formula. There is a difference between the House and Senate on the effective date. The House has an effective date of July 1 for distribution calculations that would occur after that. And the Senate effective date is October 1, both of 2015. The allocation of funds coming out of these formulas is done essentially on a calendar year basis by MnDOT through commissioner's orders, kind of aligning with the calendar cycle that the counties have. And this might be a provision, I don't know if the committee wants to note this one for now. It might be a provision that gets tied into some of the other local road funding components. Just the committee is aware that there could be implications. So this doesn't directly change the amount of funding or utilized funds, but it does impact the split in how much funds are allocated under the two formulas.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, we had a little side conference here with Mr. Peterson from MnDOT. He says it doesn't matter, the effective date. But I don't know, Mr. Peterson, did you want to? Yeah, okay. I see shrugging and shaking head. Mr. Chair, I'm fine with adopting this now or waiting till later as it gets tied into the other local road stuff, but with a slight preference towards adopting it now, just because this has been a conversation of long standing. This is an agreement that all 87 counties have come to, and it just makes a ton of sense. Kind of gets us out of, or gets the agency out of doing a very, very elaborate and complicated calculation every year. This kind of grandfathers in 68% of all sources under the old formula, and then under the new formula counts 32% of all sources, regardless of whether they're actually new or old. It just seems to make a lot of sense, because it's been a hard-won, difficult forging of a great statewide compromise. And I'm agnostic on the effective date, with a slight preference towards the House effective date.
All right. Well, then I will move section 18 of the House language, 34.16, to 35.7. That cleared all? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay? That motion is adopted.
Mr. Chair and members, then if you turn to page R60, you'll find the next identical provision between the House and Senate. And this is section 20 on the House side, section 2 on the Senate side. And this is a change on a special type of license plate for driveway in transit, where the plate is associated with a business that is engaged in driveway or towing type operations. So the plate doesn't follow the vehicle, it kind of stays with the business. And this is, the essence of the change is to allow plate issuance to businesses that, if they're located in Minnesota, would be able to use the plate outside of Minnesota. Under current law, the plate is only for use within the state, and there is a slight fiscal implication to this that's outside of the general fund.
Mr. Chair, on the fiscal impact on this, both the House and the Senate are identical. It is $70,000 over the biennium in loss to the driver and vehicle services account, and $70,000 estimated loss to the highway user tax distribution fund.
I'm sorry. So they are identical.
So, Mr. Chair, I'll move the Senate language in this instance. So that's,
Where's this section?
so I'll move, starting on line 75.24 on the Senate side, section 2 on page R60 through 76.14 on R61.
Senator Dibble moves section 2, line item 75.24 through 76.14. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay? That motion is approved. Mr. Burris.
Mr. Chair and members, the next one that is on the list here is on page R119. This is another executive branch initiative. It starts at the bottom of R119. It's section 47 on the House side, section 16 on the Senate side. And this would modify the fee setting for the state patrol when providing vehicle escorts. That's the escort service that goes along with some of the overdimensional permits as a primary example when there's a wide load or an extra long load and escorts are required. Under current law, the fees are set in statute, and the change would be to authorize the Commissioner of Public Safety to set the fee based on the actual costs. It would be up to annual change. And the language is identical between the House and Senate on this provision.
And Mr. Chair, I will note that there is also an identical fiscal impact to this of $150,000 estimated a year in additional special revenue funds generated by this and then appropriated out by it. The fiscal impact is identical between the House and the Senate.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. I will also move, we're back in the House language, section 47, 48.32 would go to 49.11 with the effective date, is that correct? Yep. Any questions on that? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion prevails. In our last one.
Mr. Chair and members, the last of the identical provisions or technical difference provisions is another governor's agency submission. That's starts on page R120, and this is a change to the local contribution requirements for aid that MnDOT provides to airports. And there are a couple of different aspects to it, but the essence of it is to broaden the authority around how much a local unit of government or local airport would be required to put forth on aid coming in, and kind of broadening some of the forms or uses that the aid could be put to. And this is also identical between the House and Senate. It's section 49 on the House side, section 21 on the Senate side.
So, Mr. Chair, I'll move the Senate language in this instance. So, a little bit. It says section 17, but I think on the cheat sheet, but I think it's actually section 21. Yeah.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Burris.
Senator Dibble, yes, that's my mistake. On the cheat sheet, it should be section 21.
Okay, great.
Okay,
So I'll move section 21, starting on line 89.4 of R120, all the way through to line 90.36 on R122.
Senator Dibble moves section 21, 89.4 through 90.36 for Senate language for adoption. All those, any questions? All those in favor say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion prevails. All right. All right, with that, members, I appreciate the work that we've done today, and certainly, again, thank you to staff for walking us through the two bills and where we stand and how we came to this point. Look forward to working through the next days ahead, and thank you all for your time. Thank you to the members of the audience for being here today, and the next meeting will be to the call of Chair Dibble.
And that would have to be tomorrow if I'm going to do so, otherwise then the gavel reverts to you the following day. Haven't thought too hard yet about it, nor have we thought about times. Have we thought about times? No? Okay, so we'll think hard, and we'll have some communications yet this afternoon with you. An idea that I have is that we take a look at the similars, and in particular, the volunteer firefighter benefits and reporting. I'll ask Senator Jensen, who's been our lead on that, to take a look at the House approach and see what makes the most sense, and maybe make a recommendation to us. And so maybe we can, if we can figure out some of our differences in the meantime, maybe we can come back to the similars tomorrow.
Sounds fantastic.
All right.
With that, this meeting is adjourned.